What's up, guys? Welcome to our first episode covering sellers or buyers. But in this case, we are starting off with the biggest sellers, in our opinion, the Vancouver Canucks. So they get rid of the biggest fish available in Bo Horvat. He goes to New York Islanders. They get Anthony Beauvillier and Aro Radi and a 2023 first round pick. So that is closed up. It's done. But there's other assets available that could fetch them a lot in return. You have Thatcher Demko, Brock Boeser, Luke Schenn, and many more. So we're going to be covering, the trade bait pieces that are left on the Vancouver Canucks and determining whether or not they will be traded and what they will be traded for. So let's start off with the first player, Brock Boeser, who is possibly the next piece that will be traded out of Vancouver. There's a lot of interest towards him. There's a lot of teams that are looking to add Brock Boeser in their top six heading into the playoffs. And Luca, can you name some of those teams, please?
Well, we have the Minnesota Wild, obviously, because he's from there. The New York Islanders are always the team that's shown interest in him. The New Jersey Devils have been talked about as a potential destination for him. Lately, I've seen rumors of potentially even the Boston Bruins being a team that could show some interest in him. We've seen the Montreal Canadiens also being linked with him at some point. So those are kind of the teams that have been talked about a lot.
Washington Capitals as well.
Washington Capitals was another
Yeah.
one that I was just about to mention. So there's some teams that could and Colorado as well was another one that there was talks about potentially adding as well.
The New York
I think
Islanders are actually connected to Brock Boeser before they traded for Bo Horvat.
yeah.
So do you think there's a possibility that the Islanders and Canucks are not done yet in terms of making deals?
Yeah, of course. I mean, bro, like the Islanders made it pretty clear in their press conference that if there was a trade that made sense, they were going to do it. I think Stefan Rosner, even when he came on our podcast, kind of reiterated that the Islanders were willing to make more moves. And look, the Islanders they need scoring. They added one with Bo Horvat. If they add Brock Boeser, I think that can help them too as well. And I think that they're trying to go for it, and I think that Brock Boeser makes a lot of sense for them. Another team that I think to watch out for, we've talked about them a lot. They're interested in Timo Meyer. I think if Timo Meyer doesn't work out for them, I wouldn't be surprised if the Devils, shift their attention to Brock Boeser as well. He's another name that I think could make sense for them. The one that I think probably ends up happening just because it makes a lot of sense too is Minnesota. I think Minnesota's been kicking tires on him for a while. He's from there as well. And so I think the expectation is that he'll probably end up in Minnesota. And I think that, for him too, he'd probably be really happy about that too. He's closer to family. We know that he lost his dad early on last year. So I think being close to his family is something that I think he would want too. So, Minnesota is definitely a destination for him. But one underrated one that I think is also one that could happen. It all depends on what the asking price is for Brock Boeser. Could be the Montreal Canadiens, and I think the reason for that is just because Montreal is kind of in that rebuild mode. But if you add a guy like Brock Boeser to an already decent forward core in Montreal, maybe you can kind of revive him. We know Montreal likes reclamation projects. We know Kent Hughes likes to turn guys around. Look what he did with Sean Monahan. They've shown interest in Puljujarvi, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if they're one of the teams that potentially makes an offer to Vancouver for Brock Boeser because he's 25 and still has 3 years left on his deal. And with the guys that they're going to move as well, it could be an opportunity to potentially pounce on a guy that could potentially be pretty good in Montreal. So I think that those are probably the destinations that Boeser ends up with. Um, in my opinion, I think the one that makes the most sense, though, for me is either the Devils or the Minnesota Wild, just because I think those are two destinations that I think he'd love to go to and
Yeah,
to get
and
moving in
Minnesota, they
their
lost Kevin Fiala, so that's a lot of goals in
yeah,
terms of that production of that player, and him, joining the LA Kings, he's dominated with the LA Kings. It's been a
yeah, he's played well.
fantastic
He's played
fit,
very,
and
very
even
well.
though they got a significant amount in terms of a return for Fiala, they're missing Fiala, so they could use a guy like Brock Boeser. Not only that, but in terms of the asking price. I think if they could get a first round pick out of Besser, that would be fantastic. His potential is an elite sniper. We've seen him score many goals before, but this year he only has 9 goals and 21 assists for a total of 30 points in 41 games. So he needs to get back at scoring goals. So he needs a change of scenery. But I wouldn't be surprised that maybe a second round pick and maybe a B level prospect is the asking price as well. It honestly varies. If they wait closer to the deadline, they could get a lot more for Brock Besser. But if they do what they did with Bo Horvat, they could get a lot less.
But
They
one thing
tend to
that I
get
want to
desperate during towards the deadline.
Yeah, and the other thing too that I want to say about Brock Besser really quickly, and another one on the list. Actually, there's two other ones on the list that also have term on their deals. Is Brock Besser has 3 years left, right? He just signed that extension. So for a team that's picking up Brock Besser, they're not just picking up Brock Besser for this year; they're picking up Brock Besser for the next 2 years after that. And I think the biggest question mark with Vancouver, and that's something that Darren Dreger and Elliot Friedman both reported, is that they're looking teams are waiting to see if Vancouver's willing to retain salary, because if Vancouver's willing to retain salary, well, it also makes the return on Brock Besser a lot more, just because Vancouver's willing to take some money. But not only that, there's going to be more teams that are going to be willing to actually go ahead and part ways with, let's say, an asking price of Brock Besser, because they're going to be able to free up some cap space, because as you know, cap space is very valuable in this league. And so I think for that reason, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Besser. I think he probably gets traded closer to the deadline, but this guy's been in trade rumors for the last year and a half. Like, at some point, Vancouver's got to part ways with him. And I think he wants that, and I think the team wants that too. And I think it's just hopefully, sooner rather than later. I think just for both parties to just move on and start fresh, I think.
Yeah, and he's only 25 years old, so,
Yeah.
going to any team with term on his contract, it could be a fantastic fit for him and the new team that he's on. So, moving forward, a name that's picked up steam in terms of trade rumors recently, but it was mentioned at the start of the season, Thatcher Demko. So he's been linked to the Buffalo Sabres, Pittsburgh Penguins, and LA Kings. So three teams
And
that are in
Columbus.
Oh, Columbus is another one too. So four teams that are in desperate need of goaltending, three in a playoff race, one excluded out of the playoffs and most likely will win the Bedard sweepstakes, but that's a whole different story for another time. But in terms of fit here, if I'm asking for a starting goaltender, I'm gonna have to give up a first round pick. That's where it starts in terms of trade value for him, maybe a little bit more. Thatcher Demko stole Markstrom's job, which allowed them to feel comfortable with keeping Demko over Markstrom, and Markstrom went to Calgary. And we all know how that turned out. But now Demko could potentially be on his way out. There was talks about him not being happy in Vancouver, but that was debunked a couple days after that, saying that there's no signs of him not being happy. I mean, look at the whole situation in Vancouver. I don't think anyone is happy with how things went down, but I do believe that there's still players on this team that believe that this team could get back on track. And I think Demko is one of those players. There's this whole curse thing with the goalies in Vancouver that they never last. You have Corey Schneider, you have Roberto Luongo, Markstrom, now potentially Demko. So, in terms of the whole situation, I think it would be dumb for Vancouver to get rid of Demko because they don't really have any great goalie prospects. They got rid of Michael DiPietro already to the Boston Bruins a couple months ago. So I wouldn't really do that type of move unless I get a boatload and I get a goalie
Well,
prospect that could potentially be a starter in the future.
Well, I think what's interesting about Demko is, so that, look, there isn't that many teams in the league really that need goaltending, that like really need goaltending, at least for now, right? I think there's been a few goalies that have been linked to potential moves away. There's been talks about Corpusalo. There's been talks about Vamelka in Arizona. There's been talks about Demko, and to some extent even Jake Allen, right? And I think that ultimately, the one that I think gets moved is Demko. And if you look at the teams that are interested, right? Columbus makes a ton of sense because Elvis hasn't played well. Corpusalo hasn't played well, and as much as, yes, Columbus has had a bad year this year, they also don't have a decor. They're all injured. And so I think that next year, and if Columbus is trying to build for next year as well, adding Demko to a lineup like Columbus, which is going to add another top prospect again this year and potentially make some moves in the offseason, I think could make a lot of sense. It's just a matter of what do you give up to necessarily, pry Demko out of Vancouver right now. I don't know. That's more of an offseason move, I think, if you're Columbus. If you're Pittsburgh, Buffalo, or LA, this is very intriguing. And the reason it's intriguing is because, yes, Demko's currently injured right now. But, if he does come back and if he's ready to play before the deadline kicks in, I believe that a team that would benefit him greatly, and we talked about this on when Zader came on as well with Stefan Rosner. I think the best place for him is Buffalo. And I think the reason the best place for him is Buffalo is because Buffalo's fighting for a playoff spot. They have goaltending prospects. They have players they can give up as well. And I think it works for both sides because Demko's also American, right? So he goes back to kind of, in America, close to his family in a sense. And not
Kind
only
of. It
that,
is. It's in the state of New
yeah,
York.
but that's what I'm saying. So, he's close to his family as well. But the other thing is, too, is that it allows him to be on a team that's competing for a playoff spot, is doing really well, and is on the up, right? And I think that that's what Demko wants. I think Pittsburgh and LA makes a lot of sense, too, because they have a lot of prospects. I just don't know if their goaltending prospects is necessarily enticing for Vancouver
No,
to
they would move.
necessarily,
They would have to move out of defensemen, and there's been
yeah,
talk about like
or a
Sean
forward.
Walker
Yeah.
and other guys that they
But
could move out. So I mean, for them, if they make a trade with LA, they get defense in return for
yeah,
Vancouver.
and
If
I
they make
think
a
for
trade with Buffalo, they're gonna get a goalie prospect in return. In terms of Pittsburgh, which is literally the team I would stay far away from because they literally have nothing to offer, even though Tristan Jarry is at the end of his contract, meaning he's going to be a UFA and he could cost a lot of money. Having Demko, who's under term for the next couple years, that could be a fit
yeah.
for them. But
But
at
the
the
other
same
thing,
time, you're thinking of a rebuilding team in Vancouver, and you're gonna want to stack up on prospects and picks.
yeah, but if you're Pittsburgh too, like the other thing is too, it depends on what the asking price is for Demko. But the other thing, like, look, to me, I look at Demko, like you said, I think it starts with a first round pick and maybe a B level prospect. If you're Pittsburgh, you can do that. And the reason you can do that is because Pittsburgh's A is known for trading first round picks, anyways. They do it every year. And the other thing is too, is that they have, you know, a guy that I think a lot of teams are interested in, and that's P.O. Joseph, who's still young enough. I think if Pittsburgh throws him in, potentially a first round pick, and let's say a second or a third just to sweeten the deal, I think they can get that done pretty easily with Vancouver. And the other thing too is that look, Casey DeSmith hasn't played well this season, and Tristan Jarry's an unrestricted free agent. So if you're Pittsburgh, you're trying to figure out who your goaltender is going to be, right? DeSmith isn't the answer. Jarry injury prone, but that's the other thing too. Demko is also injury prone, but he's a better goaltender than Tristan Jarry, in my opinion, right? So if you're Pittsburgh, you're getting a goalie with term. You don't have to re-sign Tristan Jarry at that point, and your backup becomes, let's say, Casey DeSmith, and you have a potential guy in, P.O. Joseph that you can potentially move away your first round pick, and you try to do that. Plus, you're also in a playoff race, so you're getting a goaltender who is healthy enough and competing with Tristan Jarry towards the end of the year to potentially bring you in the playoffs and go far. So, we know Pittsburgh are trying to compete. So I think it makes sense. And like I said, I think just to reiterate kind of on the last point, I think the best one is Buffalo. I think Buffalo makes the most amount of sense. And I think if
I
you're
agree.
Buffalo, you have to pounce on this, as soon as
It's
possible. If he's
literally
healthy. If he's
it's
healthy.
it's literally the last piece they need, and if they really want to secure a playoff spot this season, um, that's the way to go, to add
If he's
a
healthy. If
legitimate
he's healthy,
starting
yes.
goaltender.
If
Yeah,
he's healthy, yes. If he's injured, like forget it. If
because
come trade deadline he's still injured, like you can't take
and
that
and he's
risk.
and he's only $5 million for the next couple of
Yeah.
years, so that's fantastic. He is 27 years old, so even young, he fits that window for Buffalo, who are a very young and talented team for they're going to be competitive for years to come. But at the same time, I do believe that Craig Anderson is probably playing his last season, if I'm not mistaken,
Yep,
wearing a
for sure.
Buffalo Sabres jersey. So they have to think long term too. So I think Demko makes a lot of sense, and
I
because of the
want to
goalie
move.
prospects.
I want to move on to probably the hottest name that's being talked about right now out of Vancouver, and that's Luke Schenn. And surprisingly, it's Luke Schenn. But one of the things is that Luke Schenn's had a really underrated season, and I know that Zader was talking about it on our podcast of how well he's played. And he's drawing a lot of interest from a lot of contenders, right? There's been talk about Carolina. There's been talk about the Bruins. There's been talk about the Leafs and going back there. There's also been talks about Tampa Bay and him potentially returning over there. Luke
Boston.
Schenn, Boston, I mentioned the Bruins
Uh,
already,
okay.
but as well, and also the Winnipeg Jets are another team that I saw a little bit of in a potential rumor. To me, I think Luke Schenn is going to be one of those guys that's going to end up being kind of what Sherratt got last year as a deal. I know people are going to call me crazy, but just hear me out a second. Luke Schenn's played some really good hockey, and apparently the rumor is that the asking price for defensemen, and it's been talked about with Gavrikov and Edmondson, that it's a first round pick. I think with how well Luke Schenn has played and the fact that he's played better than Gavrikov and Edmondson, I could see Luke Schenn getting a first round pick from a contender. And I think if you're the Bruins, this is the perfect type of player to go after, just because this guy's won 2 Stanley Cups, right? Did it with Tampa, but not only that, he's got playoff experience, and he's probably the steadiest defenseman you can get, right? And we all know the Bruins, they like their depth defensemen. They like to play a physical game. I think Luke Schenn brings that as well. And he's very sound in his own zone. So I think for me, Boston is probably the best destination for him. Look, I'll be honest. I think if you're any team in the NHL, you should probably be showing interest in Luke Schenn, because, especially if you're a playoff team, you should probably be showing interest in Luke Schenn because he's probably the hottest name right now. We always talked about Gavrikov and Edmondson. I think Luke Schenn is going to be the one that is going to have the bidding war, in my opinion.
I would also like to add that Luke Schenn is only 850K and is
Yeah,
only 33 years old. So even if you do
yeah.
give up a first round pick, it will not cost a lot in terms of re-signing him, and you could still get a lot of
But,
good hockey out
but
of him, at least
that's
for the
why
next
it
couple
makes
of
it
years.
so enticing, right? If you're a team, like, even if you're like a team on the fringe, right? Like if you're Buffalo, right? This guy, because of or if you're forget it, no, if you're a team that's overcat, like if you're Vegas, for example, right? This makes so much sense for you to go after because he's 850K. And yes, he's a UFA, but you can re-sign him probably on the cheap for like $1-2 million max, right? And you'll be set. And he's really good. Like, Luke Schenn hasn't played bad hockey in a long time, right? He's been very good on every team that he's been on. He's a +7 on Vancouver, which says a lot about how good he's been, considering the Canucks are not great defensively. I think, to me, any team in the league should be interested. I think he probably ends up in Boston or Tampa. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up going back to Tampa, just because, listen, Tampa's already won 2 Stanley
He's
Cups. He's
familiar with
familiar
the
with the
system. He's won his two
That's it.
Stanley Cups there. It would be a good fit. But not only that, there's also been rumblings that apparently um, that he's been starting to develop a really strong relationship with Rick Tocchet, and he might actually end up staying because Patrick Alvin was saying that he's a very attractive player, what he brings on the ice, but also off the ice. So that could refer to him, liking the player, but also saying that other
Yeah.
teams like the player and that he could be dealt. But in terms of Pedersen or Kuzmenko or Hughes being moved, forget about
No,
that.
that's not happening.
Ekman Larson, unmovable. There's no way that
Buyout. He's getting
happens.
bought. He's getting bought out at the end of the year.
Tyler Myers, if you retain salary, maybe he still has 2 years left. Um,
Off-season
looking guy,
move.
yeah, looking at like guys like Riley Stillman, Travis Dermont, maybe
Maybe
Ethan
Dermott
Bear.
gets some interest. You might get a fourth or a fifth for Dermott. You
Yeah,
might be able to.
Ethan
Um,
Bear has been a fantastic fit, and they just traded for him, so that's not gonna
yeah,
happen.
I think they keep him.
Dakota Johnson, Joshua, I think he stays as well. Connor Garland, has been rumors about maybe buying him out if they cannot trade him, so we'll see what happens there. JT Miller, fantastic offensively, but we've repeated this multiple times that he's bad defensively, and with the contract he has, I don't think it's possible to move him, so he is most likely to stay. And in
Yeah.
terms of flipping a guy like Anthony Beauvillier, if they get a fantastic offer for Beauvillier, for sure they could move
Well, I
him.
think it depends, right? Like, the other thing too with Bovilla, you gotta understand is that, like, they kind of have 3 weeks now to test him out, essentially, right? In the sense where they're going to put him in the lineup, maybe give him an opportunity to play on the top six and see what they can get out of Beauvillier. If he starts performing in Vancouver and they want to keep him, they're more than happy to do that. But if Vancouver looks at the opportunity and the team comes in and says, "Hey, we'll take Beauvillier off your hands. We believe he's a better fit for us," I wouldn't be surprised if they move him and they get some assets for him as well, right? There was a lot of rumors when the Islanders traded him to Vancouver that the Canucks probably were going to end up flipping him just because he's not a Tocchet type of player. But we'll see. Maybe Vancouver keeps him. He makes 4.1 million this year and next year. So it's not a risk if they keep him, but at the same time, he's probably more of an attractive player next year compared to this year, just because he'll be a rental next year and
Yeah.
he'll probably fetch more. Let's say.
And even though they're big sellers, don't expect every single
No,
player to
no,
be
no.
traded. We saw this the Montreal Canadiens where they were going to be very active sellers, and they did trade a lot of players. But there's still some of those players that remain and that will be traded possibly at this deadline or during the offseason. So don't expect them to do a fire sale and everyone is going to be traded. But the ones that we covered the most here, Brock Boeser, Luke Schenn, and Thatcher
Let me
Demko
ask you.
are probably gonna be the 3 guys that are gone by the deadline.
Let me ask you this. Okay, so out of the three guys that you just mentioned, Shen, Besser, and Demko, who do you think is the one that is probably 100% guaranteed getting traded?
Brock Boeser, because of all the rumors, because of how they've treated him over the last couple of years, especially with the death of his father and not really respecting him,
Yeah.
um, scratching him on, Cancer Fights hockey night as well, knowing that his dad
Unfortunately, yeah.
had passed away due to cancer. Thatcher Demko, it's only recently that we've been hearing that he's not happy or whatever,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's still very,
New.
premature, and in
Yeah.
terms of Luke Shen, if they like the player, if they like him as a leader, maybe they could potentially, name him captain, temporarily until, Pedersen is ready,
Nah, just give it to
or
Pedersen at that point. You might
or
as well
yeah,
just.
or they could do that as well, but we'll see what happens. But guys, we'd like to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Who gets traded out of Vancouver? What should they be asking for Brock Boeser, Demko, Luke Shen, and others? And if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and we have a lot more content concerning the 2023 trade deadline and a lot more episodes like this for buyers and for sellers. We'll see you on the next episode of the Young Guns podcast.